Welcome back to this podcast series between now and next. In episode 2 today, we're going to explore the emergence, this idea of where we are seeing signals from beyond that are beginning to affect our daily life and how we live. So just as a reminder, this podcast series is exploring these spaces between collapse and renewal, between now and next, as this liminal threshold of aliveness that truly is the place that we need to be. And if you're uncomfortable right now, then you're in that place that is necessary for our growth and evolution, not just as a humanity, but as a collective intelligence that includes the natural, the subtle, the mystical, and the many realms that we are always in relationship with. I'm Annie Browning, for those of you that don't know me, and I'm delighted to meet with you and connect with you today. And as we engage in this topic, I, as always, encourage you to consider the collective implications of the topic, but also to bring it back to the personal, to consider something in your life that is deeply personal and relational, a challenge or a question that you may have in your life, because it will make it more real and applied and direct in terms of how you live and what's most important to you. So today we're going to look at these signals from the future as we investigate these systems, the relationships and ways of being that are already rooted and starting to crack forward from beneath the surface in terms of structures that are starting to fail. And so we'll weave together emergent initiatives. We'll look at research on transition dynamics, always lean into ancient, timeless wisdom, especially from consciousness and spirituality. And I will always give you 3 very practical strategies to use to help us recognize and participate in the birth that is occurring into more comprehensively life-affirming and accepting systems. So as always, I want to start with a personal story that, of course, you will relate to. And I invite you to consider where there has been innovation that has broken forward in your life, emergent necessities that have taken root and grown, especially when something was falling apart. So I actually worked at a hospital during the, COVID-19 epidemic. And during that point in time, many of us that were more non-essential workers, there was looking for tasks that could be done that were helpful for the whole. And there was a tremendous amount of improvising. Yes, there was a lot of protocols that were being followed and adherence to, what needed to happen in terms of ethics and making sure that care was being conducted at the highest level. And there were also many opportunities for innovation. And in particular, one experience that I had was that many nurses actually began to make masks. And those of us that were in non-essential roles started to learn how to make masks. And I was very pleased that I was someone who knew how to sew from my upbringing. But it was interesting to notice how perhaps an ancient skill, or a skill that's sort of fallen away for most of us learning, was coming back, sewing these masks from fabric on a sewing machine. And they actually used bra straps as the loops to attach. And it reminded me that in times in which there are these big systems that are starting to crack, or they just get overwhelmed in the terms of the pandemic, that this is also an opportunity for new innovation to come forward. And we start to see emergent ideas that just bubble up from the underground. They were already there, but we're simply paying attention to them in a new way. And what's interesting about this example that I gave is that it's not like the systems just went back to the way it was after the pandemic. No, I mean, there was a new way of relating to one another because there was such a cross-pollination between often roles that were very isolated in terms of each of us worked in our little silos, many of us all of a sudden were sewing together, and that immediately created very different sort of bonds and connections that couldn't have just been orchestrated by getting everyone into a room and saying, now work on this. But there was something very earthed and embodied and real that began to emerge in terms of how people related to each other. So this experience is what's called an emergence, when new patterns, structures, and possibilities arise from the breakdown of existing systems. And my story isn't isolated. You probably have many experiences, and the pandemic is a very convenient kind of reflection, even now, to consider back of where was there innovation in your own life that occurred, emergence that happened in the midst of rapid change. And across healthcare, education, agriculture, economics, and governance, there are always individuals and communities that are not waiting for permission to create alternatives. They're building the new within the shells of what was old. So let's move from here into looking at some research together, and particularly exploring the science behind emergence. And research shows us how these patterns actually start to develop and how change happens in complex symbiotic systems. Traditionally, we think about change as being either very incremental, there's gradual improvement, or something that's revolutionary, where there's an overhaul, a very sudden change that occurs. But research shows us that in terms of complex adaptive systems, there is a third pattern, and this is the one of emergence, where new forms arise in terms of relationships and interactions when there is a system that is under pressure. And right now, we are in a system that is under pressure, and you may feel it in your own life, and we certainly feel it in our broader context. And research shows that there is ecological resilience in terms of adaptive cycles, that all living systems move through these phases of growth, conservation, release, and reorganization. And the fracturing that we are experiencing right now, it resembles what we call release, when rigid, efficient, but ultimately very rigid and brittle systems start to break and crack. And what happens is there's energy that starts to release and resources that have possibility for reorganization and renewal. And when we look at systems, some of the most powerful innovations and interventions for system change involve us shifting our paradigm, shifting our perspective. That's between now and next, the mindsets out of which our systems are created. So in other words, it's not just by changing practices on the surface, but literally changing our perception and changing our mindset so that the paradigm we are aligned with is not the old one that's falling apart, but the new one that is emerging. And it operates under a completely different set of values and a very different mission and vision statement. And we know that social tipping points occur. It typically requires only a small committed minority of, there's various statistics, 3.5%, 10%, more conservatively 25%, to catalyze rapid systemic change. It only takes a small minority. Once this threshold is reached, there are new social norms and behaviors that start to take its place. Something else emerges. And it can spread very rapidly and organically. And this suggests that there are emerging alternatives that are already happening right now. They're already emerging in our awareness. We may not be aware of them yet, but it only requires a small majority, a small group of people to actually adopt these emergent patterns for them to reach a broader system. So what does this look like? Let's go and explore it from more of our wisdom traditions, looking very specifically at spirituality and consciousness. So wisdom traditions have offered many stories throughout history that speak to honoring and trusting what is essentially underground as a metaphor that's going to come forward into new life. You can think of the biblical story of casting seed on, the healthy soil and the soil that is dry and rocky, and believing and trusting and knowing that the good soil was going to eventually bear something fruitful and generative. And from the Chinese tradition, there is a story about the bamboo seed that, again, contextualize it for your own place and time. But this story goes that there was a farmer who had a bamboo seed, and he was known for growing the strongest bamboo in the region. And he would plant the seed with great care, and he would tend it, and he would water it, and he would wait, and he would watch. And there was the first year where nothing emerged from the soil. And those who were around him sort of scoffed and scolded at him that his luck had run out and he would no longer be growing the best bamboo ever again. And the farmer continued to patiently and faithfully tend to the bamboo. Really, nothing to see on the surface, just a seed underground. And a second year passed with no visible growth, and then the third and the fourth year, and yet he maintained a patient and steady watch. Neighbors questioned his sanity, and he said, "Why are you wasting time on a failed crop? Move on, plant again." The farmer said, "I trust the process." In the fifth year, a tiny shoot finally appeared, a tiny shoot. And then something extraordinary happened. And this is how emergent change occurs. In that moment, over a span of 6 months, the bamboo shoot grew to be 80 feet. And everyone was astonished, but the truth was revealed. That in that season of dormancy, in which it looked like nothing was happening, the bamboo wasn't inactive, but instead it was developing a very elaborate underground root system, a very elaborate underground root system. And once it was sustained and established, it could continue its magnificent and rapid growth. So these periods of being in between, in these threshold moments, are opportunities for us to put our roots down, to establish ourselves deep underground, to provide that very steady and solid foundation, so that when the time is right, we emerge with precision and clarity, and there is rapid, accelerated growth. And it does not happen overnight. And so in this season where you may be thinking that there is a lot falling away and nothing is happening, this is the season. This is the time to establish that invisible underground network, a relationship building, trust cultivating paradigm shift that will prepare us for whatever is ready to manifest exactly when the right conditions are ready and allow for it to be so. I offer you a poetic reflection to really bring this idea into a way that touches your heart. And this poem is by Adrienne Rich, and it's called Diving into the Wreck. And it's the invitation to explore with courage and with wholeheartedness how failing systems are offering us a hidden treasure. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. The thing I came for, the wreck, and not the story of the wreck, the thing itself, and not the myth. In short, transformational change requires an honesty about what's broken and a discernment to recognize what's valuable, not the myth or the story or the narrative about what others tell you is valuable. The real courage to dig deep and to discern with an open heart about what is within the wreck. It reminds me of the metaphor or the archetype of the muskrat who dives deep, deep, deep into the underwaters of the pond, into the muck, for nutrients and sustenance, to notice what is there. Because the emerging systems that we're describing do not emerge from nothing. Instead, they preserve and repurpose exactly the elements that came from the destruction. And they recognize that they have life-sustaining and life-supporting principles in what is falling away. So let's pivot together and talk about the 3 strategies that you can use to actively participate in the emergence. What is coming forward to the surface? So the first one is networked possibility sensing. So this is going to use, intuition. And the goal is that you're not sensing as an observer, but as a co-creator. So we know that transformation often accelerates when we deliberately connect with isolated innovations. So in other words, we do not need to be in a silo coming up with a big, brilliant idea. Breakthroughs happen when they develop in separate domains, and then we begin to link and establish their veracity between one another. So there's the power of multiples instead of isolated innovations. And the gift of multiples is that it accelerates patterns and principles that can relate across a number of fields. So one practice you may consider, if you've already joined your group that I mentioned from last time, your resilience pod, is to also engage in what we might call signal sensing, gathering together to notice where there are new and innovative regenerative approaches that are coming from even diverse sectors and even from the group itself. What are you noticing? What are you feeling? What are you sensing? What are you experiencing right now in the world? I guarantee you it will be different than what you solely as the individual will be experiencing. And then engaging in what's called pattern recognition, beginning to recognize patterns, symbiotic relationships, reciprocities, how there are parallel experiences happening between these many experiences as they're coming together. The second strategy that you may use, it's a conscious strategy, is to engage in prototyping, which sounds very fancy, but really, it's using small-scale modeling to essentially work with a system before you actually launch or create something bigger. So when we work in a way that we believe we're not going to be punished, which is kind of a big word, but really, embarrassed or exposed or vulnerable in some way for bringing forward an idea and it goes nowhere. Instead, an experimental approach is what all of us are being invited to engage in right now in the in-between. So let's bring it back to something very personal instead of systemic, because it's easier for us to work with. What would it look like to create a prototype with essentially something that's very personal for you? Let's say you have a frustration at work right now. Most of us probably do. So notice how your frustration is likely part of a larger microcosm. It's part of a system, right? So it's not just you and your frustration at work. It's probably something systemic that's happening across the whole. And rather than pushing for, HR to make a different decision or for us, some sort of rule or structure to change, the goal is that you define for yourself right now, what is it that you need? And what need are you addressing? And it may start with you. What do you need at work? What principles or ethics or values will guide your approach? Let's take it a step further. Let's say you're frustrated by a rule at work. What you most need is freedom. Let's say you are struggling with, what principles or values or ethics will guide your approach. Perhaps you're noticing that you need more flexibility. You need some malleability in your workday to feel more freedom. Identify, thirdly, what resources do you need? You just mentioned time, space. Is that something you can create on your own? Is it something you may need to ask for in a way that the system will allow at this point in time? Noticing what timeline you may follow. Is this possible in 1 week, 3 weeks? And then also how you'll measure that there is freedom in your life. What would it feel like? What would you notice in your body? What would your senses say? And this is where we just used a small example about a frustration at work, but take it a big step further about what prototypes might you start to play with in this in-between space, especially where a lot of the rules are starting to fall apart. The structures of the limitations about how things have to be. It's the perfect time to begin to develop that sense of prototyping, to play a little bit with something that's been stirring within you. But now is the time to actually practice and notice what it might want to become. And the third strategy is what we call temporal expansion. You're going to hear me talk a lot about time perception, time distortion, time dilution. It's temporal perception. When we expand our temporal perception of time, we are changing our relationship with time. So when we look at future time perception, which I spoke about in the last episode, when we expand our temporal horizon, it can decrease our intolerance of uncertainty. So we become more capable of being in uncertainty, the unknown, what's nebulous, what's obscure, what's not clear. And it enhances our agency. It increases our ability to act with purpose despite uncertainty. So this practice is more spiritual, using standard meditation and mindfulness techniques. And you may expand your perception of time instead of being locked into the moment you're in, but expand that bandwidth of time to take in more perception of time that gets us into the perception of the future by using this 3-part exercise. So first, you want to breathe in slowly for 5 counts. That's often very standard with breath practice. You're going to breathe in slowly. And with the breath, notice how you are present with whatever is arising in your awareness. Hold your breath for 3 counts. And as you hold your breath, notice how you are part of a time and a story that is bigger than you. So again, the first breath in, you're just staying present with whatever is coming forward. The hold of the breath is essentially using a mantra or an area of focus. You are staying present with time and space and your story that is beyond you. Essentially, you're expanding your perception. I am part of a bigger story, space, and time. And then exhale for 7 counts. And with the exhale, you're activating the parasympathetic system, but you're also allowing yourself to trust the unfolding process. So when we use these sorts of contemplative practices, it shifts our brains away from reactive fear toward regions in the brain that are associated with spacious awareness and creative problem solving, which is the exact mental state that you need to be in order to be present with what is emerging. So let's wrap up together. As we explore emerging possibilities, I invite you to notice whether you are just witnessing transitions or whether you are actively placing yourself right in the midst of them. And every choice that you make, whether it's conscious or not, is a choice that prioritizes interconnected relationship with yourself, systems, the natural world, the material world, the larger whole of humanity, that sense of space and time that is beyond ourselves, that will not prioritize the old paradigm of efficiency only, isolation, and outcomes that only serve the individual. Instead, we are entering an emerging paradigm that is prioritizing that place of regeneration. That what is birthed and born within you or me or we is automatically creating a cyclic and deep transformative effect that will continue to regenerate itself over and over again and naturally span and spread over time. So we've talked a lot about ways to place ourselves in the emergence, to notice those tipping points when something's starting to come to the surface, to stay present with the process, to notice what's underground, what hasn't yet emerged, but you can still feel and sense that it's moving. Because the question is not whether transformation is occurring, it is. It's rather how we engage with it and whether we do so with compassion and with consciousness. What we may perceive as being a fringe movement today will become the center point of tomorrow. It will happen. And so this is an opportunity for us to use prototypes, to sense and feel together, and to regulate our bodies through breath so that we can be present with exactly what is coming forward on the horizon. In our next episode, we're going to look at integration, how we heal not just our personal and collective narratives, but how working with our wounds, all of our wounds, are absolutely necessary to stay present between now and next, to work at a deep level, both individually and socially, to embody new systems rather than recreating old systems in new forms, where it may look different on the face, but the roots are all the same. And as we go, remember, that wisdom of the bamboo plant from ancient Chinese tradition, that even what is underground is not dormant. It is building those very essential roots that are necessary for rapid emergence. As always, thank you for joining me in this space between now and